إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to episode number 3 of our exciting journey through our Islam in the world, and at this moment actually we're finishing with Islam in Europe. In the last 2 episodes we discussed the issue of how Islam actually started in Europe, especially with the arrival of Tariq bin Ziyad in Gibraltar, in Spain, in Al-Andalus, as the Muslims called that part of the world, the Iberian Peninsula, moved on into France and even Italy and up to Switzerland. Now, exciting journeys that we have had actually, and it is really, these are places that you should definitely go and visit if you can. Take your family with you, take your children with you, and go and visit these places and see what the Muslims have left behind. There's quite some Muslim legacy that can be found in these various places of the world. The second part was talking about the Ottoman Empire, a massive empire of people who originally came from Asia, built a dynasty, the Ottoman dynasty, Uthman being the founder, the main founder, one of the biggest rulers of the world actually. Uthman left the empire behind with Orhan, who basically went to Europe in the end, and Europe, especially the Balkan Peninsula up to Vienna, where once became part of the mighty Ottoman Empire, mashallah. We're coming to the third route in Europe, the third part of how Muslims, how Islam became part of Europe and has become actually still until nowadays a part of this Judeo-Christian civilization, as they keep saying. They keep calling this continent being a continent of Judeo-Christian culture and civilization, but we should add to it Judeo-Christian Muslim civilization and culture as well. And now we're talking about Eastern Europe and Russia. We should never forget that Moscow is, if it's considered part of Europe, as it is by the way, it is one of the biggest cities in Europe, is the biggest Muslim urban center outside of the Muslim world. Again, Moscow is considered of being the biggest Muslim urban center in Europe outside of the Muslim world. Amazing Moscow. It has millions of Muslims, and not only Muslims who migrated in the Soviet Union at that time, when the Soviet Union, of course, the Central Asian republics were once part of the Soviet Union. This video is sponsored by the Muqaddimah program. For nearly 7 centuries, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah has been read and studied by scholars and students of history, sociology, politics and economics as the single most authoritative and astounding work of classical scholarship in the field of history. Embark on an enlightening educational venture led by Muslim scholars and teachers delving into Islamic history, sociology, economics and beyond. Engage with cutting-edge learning cues and multimedia components, allowing for a deeper understanding of the topics. Distinguish between the lies and the truths of the narratives told, between reliable and unreliable sources. Equip yourself with the skills to conduct deep research and build confidence to combat Islamophobia. Come and strengthen your Muslim identity today. Grab the course in the video description. But also nowadays coming from countries such as Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan and so on, but also Russians, especially women. If you go online, you can find several documentaries with regards to Muslim conversions in Russia, Russian women accepting Islam. This is an amazing and interesting story, and I think this is something that we should not just dismiss, not just put it aside, because I really think it shows how people nowadays in Europe and in general in the world are looking into having an aim in life. And mashallah, I really think that is a very interesting topic that we're discussing here, Islam in Eastern Europe and in Russia. How did Islam get there? Now, we spoke about Al-Andalus, of course. We spoke about African Muslims or Muslims from Africa arriving in the south and southwest of Europe up to Central Europe. We spoke about the Balkan Peninsula, basically Eastern Europe, Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Now, what about Eastern and Northern and Northeastern Europe? Places such as Finland, places such as Russia, such as Lithuania, Latvia, Poland. How did Islam get over there? Now, there are indigenous Muslims there, and most of them go back to a specific Central Asian tribe, a Turkic tribe as well, such as the Ottomans. This time we're talking about the Tatars. The Tatars were a Turkic tribe of Turkic origin and were one of the 5 major tribal confederations, the so-called Khanliks. And they fought the Mongol leader Genghis Khan, as many people know them and know the Mongols and know Genghis Khan, who subjugated them in 1206, while his grandson Batu Khan pushed them westwards towards the plains of Russia. Initially, both Russians and Europeans would name anybody under Mongol rule Tatar, whereas later they would call only Turkic and Mongol speakers Tatars. The Russians used this name for the Turkic Muslims of the Ukraine and Russia, whose ancestors were the Muslim Volga Bulgars, Kipchaks, Kumans, Muslim Mongols, or Turco-Mongols. So again, we see a massive mix of peoples, a mix of different tribes from Asia, and not only moving into Europe. Now, these Tatars have a very interesting story. There is actually Tatarstan in existence, but it's not an independent country. It is a province of nowadays Russia. So Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, these are 2 provinces in Russia which have a majority Muslim population, mainly of Tatar origin. The biggest group of Tatars, which are 6 million, are the so-called Volga Tatars. They can be found in Tatarstan and in Bashkortostan, in these 2 countries, or these 2 provinces of Russia, not countries, in these 2 provinces which can be found in Russia. Their language belongs to the Turkic group of languages. The Volga Bulgars, to whom the Volga Tatars trace their Islamic roots, were ruling a state that existed between the 7th and the 13th centuries around the confluence of the Volga and the Kama rivers, in what is now European Russia. So basically, between the 7th and the 13th centuries, the Volga Tatars had once their own state, their own empire again. You know, there is no people on this planet actually that didn't have once an empire. No people. And everyone, Allah gave everyone the possibility to once be up there, but then they fell again. And the ones who are ruling can fall easily again. They should never forget this. This is part of our history as humanity, as human beings. It was the Mongols who conquered their territory in the 13th century and pushed the Tatars further westwards towards Europe. So what happened then, basically, they were pushed towards Eastern Europe, pushed towards countries such as that time existed, Lithuania and Poland, which used to be once a big Commonwealth, as it was called, a big part of nowadays 2 countries, Lithuania and Poland. They used to be one big empire. And they accepted the Tatars that time and allowed them to stay in the empire. And the condition was, because they were big guys. I mean, you can imagine the time, they were not people like us nowadays. These were big guys with muscles, big men who came from Asia, and they basically accepted the condition that they would protect Lithuania and Poland against the outside enemies. So mashallah, they went into a deal with them basically and said, okay, we give you refuge as long as you protect us. And this is something I think also very important to see, that time they relied on the Muslims to protect them. So the Tatars as a tribe came over to Europe, were allowed to settle in Eastern Europe that time and to establish themselves. Now they were given certain villages where they could thrive. They were allowed to have their mosques, they were allowed to have their madrasas, their children were taught the Quran, and they were allowed to basically just develop as Muslims, mashallah. So that is a quite positive sign from their perspective, as well as later the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth allowed Muslim men, seeing that most of them were men, to marry non-Muslim women. So even Orthodox or Protestant or Catholic women who were there around that time in that area were allowed to get married to them. And this is of course very important because obviously most of these Tatars who found refuge were men. Eastern Europe, again, especially Lithuania and Poland, developed in that way, could develop peacefully in that way, because they were protected by the Muslim Tatars. I mean, this is not a small point in history, I think. Furthermore, these Muslim Tatars can also be found in countries such as Finland, in the north of Europe, in northern Europe. Finland, by the way, is not part of Scandinavia, as many people might believe. Scandinavia is everything that comes after Finland. Basically, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, these countries are parts of Scandinavia. Finland not, simply because Finland has a different history. Finnish people are not Scandinavian people of origin, but, and listen to that, Finnish people and Hungarian people have a common root, which is a Central Asian tribe. So they come from Central Asia as well as the Ottomans came, as the Tatars came. Incredible and unbelievable. We're talking about Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun, as you can hear the name, the Hun was the one who went to nowadays the country which is called Hungary. Do you see the connection? Hungary is where the Huns basically went and settled. So Attila the Hun is one of the Hungarians' ancestors. So Hungarians and Finnish people have a lot in common. A lot in common. Cultural, but also linguistically, their languages, both languages, Finnish as well as Hungarian, are both languages, they have the same root. Okay, they have the same root and have nothing to do with the rest of European languages. They are actually Turkic languages. They came from Central Asia as well. In Finland, it's very important to mention that the first Tatar Muslims migrated to Finland mainly between 1870 and 1920. These are the 50 years where the Finnish Tatars, where the Tatars were accepted to go to Finland, where they became merchants and even soldiers. They actually were part of the Finnish army, and the Finnish government allowed their families to join them later and to settle in this country. In 1925, the Finnish Islamic Association was founded, which was and still is focusing exclusively on Turkic-speaking Tatars. In 1922, just 3 years before, a very important thing happened in Europe. The Finnish Freedom of Religion Act was adopted. Okay, this happened in Finland in 1922, which meant that as one of the first Western European country to officially recognize an Islamic congregation, Finland was the country that allowed freedom of religion. That means anybody's religion was accepted. In that case, it was the Muslims. And they started building mosques, and they started also they have their own Muslim cemeteries and having their own associations. Now, in the last decades or so, the Tatar language starts disappearing. The Tatars have assimilated totally. And here we're coming to a very important point. I want you to realize that when we're talking about history, history is not some couple of days that we're talking about. We're not talking about some battles that happened in the past and that's about it. We're talking about what happens to people. What has happened to the Tatars in Eastern Europe as well as in Northern Europe? They assimilated so much that basically there is no difference anymore between the Tatar Muslims and the average white Finnish population, as well as Lithuanians and Polish and other people. They have assimilated so much into their community, into Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian and Finnish population that they've become one and the same. Now you can say, of course, there's no problem, is it? What's the problem? Well, the problem is obviously that they've also given up on their Islam. Basically, they do not practice 5 times the daily prayers. They do not practice the halal food issue. They don't slaughter halal anymore. The Quran has basically disappeared. Barely anybody can read the Quran in Arabic. Nobody learns Arabic anymore. The Islamic element of these people has totally disappeared. So this is what we call assimilation, a total going into and under the new people who accepted them, mashallah, which was a brave thing and great thing to do. However, as a Muslim, you have to be careful still to keep your identity. You have to be careful to integrate, but not to assimilate. These are 2 very important points. And nowadays, again, that's why I say history, we have to understand in order to understand what's happening nowadays. Nowadays, many people say, you have to integrate. What does it mean, integration? Now, they mean assimilation, and this is what happened to the Tatars in Eastern Europe as well as in Northern Europe. And we have, as Muslims, to be very careful. We should not assimilate, but we should integrate into societies. Integration means you keep your identity, you keep your background, you keep who you are, separate from the rest of the population. However, you speak the language of the country, you have friends, you are integrated with the others, you go to work, of course, in the society, you deal with the other people, you deal with non-Muslims as well. Your children participate in anything that is, as far as it's within the framework of Islam, halal. So all this is part of integration, but not what happened to the Tatars in Eastern Europe, assimilation. And here we're coming to an end of this episode, which I find extremely important. I keep saying that in my lectures every time. We have to really be careful to here in Europe and in the non-Muslim world, as Muslims, we have to be careful not to assimilate ourselves and our children. We have to make sure that we keep our identity as Muslims, that we keep our duties towards Allah, that we keep them up, that we make our prayers, that we have our mosques, and all this has to be part of integration rather than assimilation. Jazakumullahu khair. Thank you very much again for this wonderful episode. See you inshallah in episode number 4. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.